Hello, and welcome to the latest in the Guildford Twinning Association series of 16 plus seminars. For these seminars, our aim is to link learners of modern languages in Guildford's schools and colleges with experts who can offer insights and perspectives on what you're studying in school or at university. Although our main focus is on Guildford's German twin city, Freiburg im Breisgau, cultural studies don't stop at international borders, and we invite our experts to consider French and Spanish aspects as well as topics relevant to the study of German. This year we're delighted to have as our seminar leader Dr. Helen Hughes, Senior Lecturer in German and Film Studies at the University of Surrey. Dr. Hughes will focus on 3 films in particular, but whether these include those you're studying or not, I think you'll find her talk interesting, and she raises questions about the nature and purpose of films which apply in general. I found myself making connections between the films cited in the talk with others on the A-level specifications, and I'm confident you'll find something here which complements your study of film and informs your work and enjoyment of foreign language cinema. Please note that we also give a list of Dr. Hughes's references at the end of the talk. The pandemic of 2020 and 2021 has moved GTA events online and away from live events. So if you have a question for Dr. Hughes, please email her at h.hughes@surrey.ac.uk. And do also look at the GTA website, www.guildfordtwinning.uk, for information on other free events and past talks, including The German Love Affair with Shakespeare by Guildford-educated Dr. Ben Schofield of King's College London. It would be great to receive some feedback from students and teachers alike, and if you have suggestions for future 16 plus seminars or comments on the language of film, I'd be pleased to hear from you. When life returns to some semblance of normality, I hope to meet some of you at GTA events, but for now, just enjoy learning to speak the language of film.
So, hello everyone. I'm very happy to speak to you here on the language of film, invited by the Guildford Twinning Association. I've decided to talk about 3 films which are on the A-level list for languages. The first is the French film Lion, the hit black and white film directed by Mathieu Kassovitz. The second film is the Spanish film Volver, also extremely popular and directed by Pedro Almodovar. And the third film is German, Das Leben der anderen, also known as The Lives of Others, released in 2007, like Volver, and a thriller directed by Florian Henkel von Donnersmarck. The aspect of the language of these films I like to talk about is the ways in which they all use the materiality of the moving image and film stock, video, digital, and the different looks produced by these as part of their language. Since the transfer of film from celluloid to digital, moving image, filmic expression has begun more and more to include the material look of the film, particularly of film stock and colour choices. In maintaining a connection with the history of moving images, digital representation has taken on the task of representing the texture and reproducing the feel or the haptic quality of legacy media, film and video. So, if we take the mini-series Chernobyl, for example, which is set in 1986 and tells the story of what led up to the nuclear accident at the power station that is now in Ukraine. Realism was clearly always going to be an important aspect of the reception of the series, as we can see from this question here from the Australian Broadcasting Company. The historical drama produced by HBO and Sky was colour graded by Technicolor, once known for its bright and rather unrealistic colour film stock. It's now a company that works in digital pre- and post-production. On the Technicolor website that you can see here, they explain that the film was to respect the aesthetic of the era of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and that the colour grader Jean-Clément Sauret used the archives as an inspiration. So the film archives, that is. As you watch the series, you notice that the muted colours have a similar effect to watching archive films at the time. But the series was also meant to be high-end and scary. So Sauret, who incidentally did the colour for the Black Mirror series too, is quoted saying, "Obviously, with the subject matter it had to be a bit scary, so you avoided warm tones. There are lots of scenes lit with sodium lighting and neon, which we didn't want to make too flattering. It would have been very easy to put a wash of green or yellow on all of the scenes, but we resisted that to keep it inside a certain realism." Disturbingly real, then, is the effect of the manipulation of digital colour. It's partly based on using archival colour film stock to get a sense of period colour, and partly based on our current genre expectations with respect to science fiction and horror. So Chernobyl is an historical drama that mimics the colours of the period, partly by reproducing the effects of the colour film stock used at the time. Each of these films, made in the post-ideological era, that is, after the Cold War, engages, like Chernobyl, with the history of film stocks, incorporating it into their language too. When it comes to the language of film or of cinema, the focus is on a particular way of looking at cinema, which takes it apart or deconstructs it, showing how ideas are conveyed through placing the camera in a particular position, using lighting and movement and sounds combined. Thinking about how the film stock is part of the language expands out our understanding of how the history of cinema has come to be included in its resources for creating meaning. This is something that applies to national cinemas in particular, as particular periods have been more important than others in each national cinematic tradition. If we ask whether there are different languages for France, Spain and Germany in terms of film, we might hesitate to identify camera movement or point of view. Is it possible to identify a French cinematic language, a Spanish one and a German one, to which I might refer here in my talk? It sounds impossible, but we can recognise the French New Wave. We can recognise that Luis Buñuel and Pedro Almodóvar might share something Spanish about their filmmaking. And we might recognise the German roots of horror or fantasy film. Part of that recognition, I think, comes from the film stock and its effects on the look of film during particular periods. In 1969, a famous manifesto put forward the idea that there are 3 different languages to cinema. The manifesto was called Towards a Third Cinema, and it was written by the Argentine filmmakers Fernando Solonas and Octavio Retino, and it was concerned with the politics of cinema production in countries which at that time were called Third World or underdeveloped countries. So the idea of third cinema or underdeveloped cinema, which it was sometimes also called, related to that. As a cinema emerging out of difficult economic circumstances, it had to use whatever resources were available in terms of film stock, and so made the stock itself part of its language. In the essay is also a retrospective idea of first and second cinema. The first is that created in Hollywood, in terms of its continuity cinematography and use of genre. The look and feel of classical Hollywood is definitive. It's designed to focus the audience on an event as if it were real. Even spectacular events are meant to create a believable world, rather than to be appreciated in themselves, although of course we do. The film stock is at issue insofar as it is up to date with the latest achievements in clarity, colour or format. The second cinema is in part a reaction to the ways in which continuity cinema had defined the language. This was called Auteur Cinema and is associated with the European new waves in Italy and France in particular. In second cinema, the film auteur or director is more self-conscious about the use of conventions and to some extent parodies them. Second cinema made film more visible as a medium, more through its breaking of narrative conventions than through its focus on material or film stock. Nevertheless, by making the conventions more visible, the look of auteur cinema is less professional. They also had much smaller budgets. So we could say that second cinema is a European cinema that wants the audience to notice that the film is constructed, so it is a film. The first declared example of third cinema was the Battle of Algiers, about the War of Independence in Algeria. It combined documentary images shot in a guerrilla style, so not carefully framed but handheld and black and white, with a fictional story shot more conventionally. Another film made in Cuba called Memories of Underdevelopment by Thomas Gutierrez Alea in 1968 also used this style. These films, like auteur cinema, want the audience to notice the film is a film, but also to notice the conditions in which the film's made, rough conditions in which it's difficult to make a film. And it's also meant not just to describe the world it's looking at, but to change it. It's guerrilla cinema, like guerrilla war, shot fast and edited together without too much thought about aesthetics. What's important is the urgency of the film as a medium of communication. So first, second and third cinema were all taking place together at the same time in the second half of the 20th century. The European new waves were a product of the period after World War II, when cinema was subsidised by national governments, partly to encourage the revival of cinema, but also partly in response to the cinema of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Western European cinema represented the artistic expressivity of the filmmaker, understood as the director, and it was normal for it to be critical about social issues and for it to experiment with formal aspects of cinematography and narrative development. This contrasted strongly with aspects of the cinema of socialist realism, which was more conventionalised and not critical of the state. During the 1980s, funding for new wave experimental auteur cinema became more scarce, as governments competed more through economic development than through cultural expression, and European production became either very reduced or much more like commercial cinema, like Hollywood again. So by the time we get to the language of European cinema in the post-Cold War period, so after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's still a dominant language called continuity cinema, which might still be seen as first cinema. But that cinema is now incorporating some of the creativity of auteur film and some of the revolutionary zeal of third cinema or guerrilla filmmaking. During the 1990s, the French government fought tooth and nail to save its cinema and television industry from deregulation and complete exposure to the power of US media. France secured a quota for its production and so still had a strong film industry, and indeed still does today. The films that we're looking at then are 3 films, if we can remember those, were all produced after the Cold War, but before the digital distribution of films online, which only really got going in 2006 with the launch of YouTube. When Netflix started in 1997, you sent your order by email, but you got your DVD in the post. I remember the little square envelopes well. Online streaming started in 2007, but all the films online were terrible, and all the good films still came in little square envelopes. By 2012, the Netflix we know was in place, with some production of its own content. So we can watch all of our 3 films, Laien, Bolbert and Das Leben der Anderen, online, but they all come, originally, from a pre-streaming world. Laien was shot on black and white celluloid, on a particularly grainy stock of the kind used out of necessity by Italian filmmakers after World War II. Today you could achieve the effect of this stock digitally, but you probably wouldn't quite get the authentic feel of expression that comes from the decision to refer to history in this way. The Italian cinema in the last years of World War II was called Neo-Realism, and it was an inspiration not only for the new waves in Europe, but also for third cinema, because of the way in which it used the material to hand out of necessity. So we could say that Laien is using both the language of the French New Wave and the language of third cinema or post-colonial cinema. Bolbert and The Lives of Others are, as I've said now several times, both films from 2007. That's the year after YouTube launched. Bolbert was still, however, shot on celluloid, using 35mm Eastman Kodak colour film stock and processed by Technicolor Labs. All very traditional. At that time, you couldn't quite get the kind of colour saturation achieved in Bolbert using digital cameras, and in the cinema, most films were also still projected on celluloid. The processing of the film stock was, however, digital. So we share the language of high-quality colourless celluloid with classic films like The Wizard of Oz to create a kind of magical realism, but Almodovar uses this medium to tell a story about the way in which contemporary Spain deals with its ghosts. Bolbert means to return, and what we see on celluloid is the return of one of Almodovar's principal collaborators, the actress Carmen Maura, with whom he made his first successful film. That film had the style of a comic in colour and used an irreverent approach to sex and sexuality to challenge the social mores of post-Franco Spain, thus making colour part of the expression of freedom. In comparison with these 2 films, The Lives of Others seems a little tame, but it is perhaps the most indicative for what's to come for the mainstream in the digital era. We've already mentioned the miniseries Chernobyl on Sky TV and HBO, which told the story of how the worst accident in the history of nuclear accidents came about during the Cold War in 1986. That film recreated Ukraine in the Soviet or Cold War era using digital modelling based on the photographs of buildings now in Lithuania. The Lives of Others is also a film set in the mid-1980s. It was shot like Bolbert on Eastman Kodak Color Vision 35mm film stock. But digital post-production was much more important for this film, as it attempted to reproduce the look and the subdued colour palette of the period and the place where the story is set, the communist German Democratic Republic, ruled by the Socialist Unity Party. In the film we see the technology used by the secret police at the time, which was already itself very dated. So thus far we've been thinking about the ways in which the medium of these films, the film stock and post-production, themselves are part of the language of cinema. The feeling that they evoke as film portrayals of a fictional world depends on these variations in media, what can be done with them, the way they refer to the history of cinema itself. All three start out as films shot on celluloid, and they make strong references to the new waves, but their journey to us is through digital screens. The traces of their transfer from film through post-production and then through restoration can be seen and felt. La Haine had its 25th birthday in 2020, and for the occasion a brand new digital restoration was made. The process of restoration always brings up questions about how the film was originally intended, what was accidental, what has been destroyed by the passage of time. The older the film, the more difficult the questions. When it comes to Italian Neo-Realist films made at the end of World War II, these questions are particularly difficult, as the filmmakers did not exactly intend to make them dark and grainy, with sometimes barely audible sound. But these qualities were appreciated by critics as what made them authentic expressions of a time and a place. So how do we see this when it comes to La Haine? Clearly the black and white grainy film stock was intended, as were the shaky handheld camera sequences, the following shots portraying a day in the life of three characters in the banlieue on the outskirts of Paris. But there is another language here too, which is not like Italian neo-realist film. The film begins with an edited sequence of news images covering a riot in the Parisian suburbs in July 1995. The images of a kind of civil war between youth and riot police are explained by a news reporter whose words tell it from the point of view of the state. This collage uses the technique of neo-realism and third cinema, starting with the documentation of a social reality. When the film shifts from this point to tell the story from the point of view of the characters, friends from the quarter caught up in and then participating in the riot, there might be an expectation that the film will turn to colour, but instead it remains in black and white. This doesn't mean the style stays the same, as it shifts from realism to a highly cineliterate and playful engagement with the French New Wave alongside other media. In an article which speaks along with the film and its politics, Sharma and Sharma describe it as a reflexive, hyper-stylized realism. They argue that the film is acutely cognizant of its own representational practices, and that its political stance involves a subjective account of altered existence, of alienated existence in the banlieue. The representation of the alienation of youth is of course about as French as it comes. Sartre's Nausea, Camus' L'étranger, and Godard's Breathless, Truffaut's 400 Blows. The language of social alienation is that which tells us that the film is conscious of its style, in the same way that the characters are conscious of their position in society, and the way they orient their clothes, their behaviour, and their haircuts as an act of expression. It's a strong expression of the self-conscious tradition of French cinema that merges the energy of a mix of cinematic languages with the story of a community that's multicultural. We could say that the three central characters bring to the film their own sense of their own identity and their experience that the economy of their culture is not permitted its space in the economics of post-Cold War France. Part of the expression is an extreme use of language that's ignored, a constant attempt to get something to happen at all, the selling and use of drugs, the creation of an illegal cafe on top of a tall building where you can buy a hot dog. At the outset there's Saïd's graffiti, a quintessential expression of creative alienation, if ever there was one. So what is it about the language of this film that made the French president study it and insist that his cabinet view it to understand the youth of the day and its forms of expression? Why were they taken over by the device of the ticking clock, a standard trick used by almost every thriller? Was it perhaps the implication that the violence demonstrated by the riot police was an inappropriate response to normal youth behaviour? Was it simply to get some recognition for the cultural energy in the banlieue that could in fact be encouraged rather than shut down? While in the 1970s art might have been a spur for development, in the film it's shown as elitist and out of touch with communities. The argument, if there is one, is for a shift to a culture generated elsewhere, in a more energetic space, in the neighbourhoods where the alternative cafes of the 1970s were once set up. And so, in the language of the film, there are multiple references to a continuity of culture and popular music from across the decades. As the BFI website demonstrates, from Bob Marley in the opening scenes to the great DJ scene where Cut Killer mixes American rapper KRS One Sound of the Police and Edith Piaf's Non, je ne regrette rien. This continuity would have connected the generation in government with the youth in terms of values and cultural practice. When it comes to the language of film, the continuity can be found in such features as direct address to camera, the following shot as the group walk through Paris, and the fluidity of the scene with the roof cafe. And even the cow represents continuity in visual language. If you watch a 1969 experimental film by Georges Rey called La Vache qui rumine, you'll fully get the point of Vince's visions of bovine calm. And I'd like to make a connection between the French film about the Holocaust, which was not shown at Cannes in 1955 owing to political objections by both French and German governments, but which has since become one of the most important French films ever made. So that's the film Night and Fog, Nuit et Brouillard by Alain René, which shows the ruins of Auschwitz and asks whether the hatred that this place represents has really gone away. As young French citizens were conscripted to fight the war in Algeria, This film was particularly relevant and remains so. The short story, told in the toilet by a Jewish survivor in La Haine, connects with that well-known film. So the film language we find in La Haine connects with experiments with form in the European New Wave Auteur Cinema. We don't exactly find this kind of experiment in the other two films, Bolbert and Lives of Others. They were, after all, released over a decade later. To talk about Bolbert first, this film can still be seen as part of the idea of European auteur cinema, as its style is very clearly marked and clearly the expression of its director, Pedro Almodóvar. Spanish cinema is an interesting case with respect to the history of European film. The French New Wave is often seen as following on from Italian Neo-Realism, along with the Italian New Wave. New German cinema, a kind of German New Wave, followed the French New Wave, once the budding filmmakers had managed to force some funding out of the television channels in the 1970s. Spanish cinema only really started to develop a new wave in the 1980s, but before that, independent low-budget films were made in the context of a wider art movement, or the Madrid scene, including Almodóvar's first film, made with Carmen Maura, which I've already mentioned. A reaction to the austere years under Franco's dictatorship, the art scene was deliberately provocative and colourful when it came to the representation of sexuality. Although Almodóvar's films became gradually more mainstream, they've always retained an originality when it comes to his characters' logic about sexual and family relations. Bolbert is probably Almodóvar's least provocative film, but his heroine, played by Penelope Cruz, does still secretly dispose of her husband after her daughter is killed him. The story of the birth of her daughter, also one that is about incest, is dug up when her mother, played by Maura, returns as a ghost. So these dark narrative details are told in a way that's reminiscent of the Spanish, Mexican, French surrealist filmmaker Luis Buñuel. It has the joyous, farcical quality of the film The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, which refers to the ongoing struggle with Latin American terrorism in Europe. The film connects with Buñuel's Mexican melodramas. Unlike the alienated youth of La Haine, these characters are rooted in their local community and in family ties. They accept local superstitions and illogicalities along with rituals and customs. Bolbert creates a farce out of a dark tale then, in which a daughter learns that her mother was raped by her own father and that her grandfather, who's now dead, is hence also her father. When her grandmother returns to visit and persuades her aunt that she is a ghost, a merry round of hide-and-seek ensues and eventually turns into discovery and reconciliation. As a mix of melodrama and farce, the film uses much of the language of 1950s Hollywood melodrama, which became a popular form in Mexico and Spain as well. Following the style of that period, Almodóvar fills the screen with wide surfaces of strong colours, turning the screen at times into almost abstract experiences of colour, particularly red. As celluloid film begins to compete with digital video, it kept ahead by offering much richer colour possibilities, which was not overtaken until the 21st century, as I've said. Now digital film manages to exceed celluloid in its reproduction of colour, including the revival of old films. The 1990s has proven a particularly vibrant decade, much like the 1950s, in that colour and light can be strongly reproduced. The digitization process brings out the material film language of Almodovar's Spanish cinema, with the floral patterned clothes, greens and reds, wide expanses of primary colour, as I have said, and particularly with its references to blood. This contrasts, of course, finally, with The Lives of Others. It's difficult to believe it's a film made in Germany in the same year as Voltaire. The film was shot on celluloid using an Arriflex camera with a high shutter speed, so that the grey Berlin winter could be filmed. Henkel von Donnersmarck describes how he found it hard to sell the film at first because it was so dark. As such, we're brought back to Chernobyl and the creation of a muted palette to represent the final decade of the Cold War, this time in the German Democratic Republic. At the beginning of The Lives of Others, there's a scene in which a man is interrogated. The space is dominated by greens tending towards khaki. The painted door, the beige telephone, and the picture of Erich Honecker on the wall are all part of the drabness of the era and the regime. These muted colours with the green wash persist even into scenes which are not related to the Stasi, to show how the entire world was imbued with a sense of the suppression of civic life. Even our heroine, always dressed in drab colours. Here we can see a television with a newsreader reporting on the publication of a report which we know has been smuggled out from this very sitting room. In the next scene, we see a copy of the Spiegel, a West German magazine, on the desk of a party official. The red is a colour that is beginning to enter into this film from the other world, the other side of the Iron Curtain. Only very gradually, at the end of the film, does the mutedness begin to give way to only very, very slightly brighter colours. More of the sky is allowed to come in to the picture, but the clothing and the decor doesn't change immediately. Then, as Dreimann reads his Stasi files as he comes to the end of Wiesler's report, towards the end of the film, he finds this fingerprint in red. And as Wiesler comes out of a building, graffiti indicates the introduction of some colour on this other side of the wall. Eventually, it's again printed matter that offers a little more brightness. As Wiesler goes past the Karl Marx bookshop, there's the sound of pneumatic drills changing the world around him. The dedication to him is on a white sheet. As Wiesler buys himself a book, the shelves behind are full of new books, and there are brighter red and yellow sleeves. This look is beginning to become a digital touchstone for the Cold War in Europe. It's a fiction, of course, partly made up of the colours produced by the plastics of the period, and partly a result of the washed out electronic colours, images, and cheaper colour film stocks used in Eastern Europe. But it's also partly a creation of the imagination, in that green and grey, punctuated by red, is characteristic of horror and dystopian fiction in the 21st century. Digital cinema is not really a full cinema, but a mix of imaginative colour and texture combinations culled from the history of cinema, television and video. It helps us to notice how the language of cinema has developed in different parts of the world in the past. And it's not just black and white versus colour, but a vast array of different choices which can convey different types of meaning.